Today we're going to take a look at the German, British, American and Soviet rifle squads and compare and contrast them to each other to see who, on paper at least, had the advantage of equipment, firepower, tactics and so on in the Second World War. The purpose is to see how the weapons, tactics and training impacted the way that the men fought, and see if the reputation of each side is based on national characteristics or if it was more down to their equipment. I'll be showing my sources and my workings out, so if you have different numbers for the weaponry or the squad sizes, that's fine. Just change the numbers to suit your own findings and go with that. And we're going to start off by looking at the theoretical on-paper capability of each squad, and then we'll think logically about how the circumstances of the war impacted each of them and how that might have changed the way that the troops decided to fight. Also, feel free to come to your own conclusions. In fact, I encourage you to do so. So, for most of the war, the size of an official German squad, or gruppe, was 10 men. There was a non-commissioned officer as leader of the squad, usually armed with an MP40 submachine gun, a deputy leader with either an MP40 or a rifle, a 3-man machine gun team with either an MG34 or MG42, and 5 riflemen with Kar 98Ks who also carried extra ammunition boxes for the machine gun. The reason they carried extra rounds was because the MG34 and its successor, the MG42, had a stupidly high rate of fire. They could send a 250 round belt of ammunition downrange in about 30 seconds, even in controlled bursts. So, to keep the machine gun firing, the men needed to carry as much ammunition for them as possible. The Kar 98K rifle had a practical rate of fire of around 10 aimed shots per minute, although one source I have says 15, but I think that's too high for aimed shots in combat. Bloke on the range managed to fire 20 rounds in a mad minute with the Kar 98K, but that proved problematic even in ideal conditions where you had the ammunition next to him rather than in pouches, which is where they would be in reality. And even he admitted the Kar 98Ks weren't good for rapid fire. So, for practical aimed shots in combat, I'm going to go with 10 rounds. And the MP40 had a practical rate of fire of up to 180 rounds per minute, at most. So, assuming that we have a full squad, and yes, that's a big assumption, but for now let's just go with it, and assuming everyone was firing their weapons, and assuming the deputy leader had an MP40 as well, on paper then, the German gruppe could put about 910 rounds into the air per minute. Obviously this is just a theoretical amount, but the point is to show the full firepower potential of a German squad. And it's clear that the Germans could send a lot of rounds downrange to suppress the enemy under a hail of fire. With 13 or more machine guns per infantry company, an effective fire screen could be maintained even if the unit was only at half strength. Let's compare this to a typical British squad, or section as the British Army calls it. The number of men in the section varied, but in 1942 the ideal section size was meant to be 8 men. It could be higher, sometimes 10 men, and perhaps as many as 11, but the official 8-man section would consist of the section commander, usually a corporal with a submachine gun like the Thompson or Sten, 4 riflemen, one with a sniper rifle, a second in command, a lance corporal, also armed with a rifle, and a 2-man Bren gun team, 1 man with a Bren, 1 with a rifle. If the squad was 10 or 11 men, the other men were probably also riflemen. Again, let's calculate the theoretical maximum firepower potential of the British section. The riflemen were mainly there to augment the fire of the Bren, and all carried ammunition for it. In fact, they each carried more ammunition for the Bren than they did ammunition for their own personal weapon. But let's just assume that they've done that and are all firing away. According to one source I have, the Lee Enfield rifle had a practical fire rate of 15 rounds per minute. Again, bloke on the range managed 26 rounds in ideal non-combat conditions where he had the ammunition next to him, so 15 rounds per minute sounds quite reasonable for combat conditions. Unlike the German machine guns, which were belt-fed, the Bren used 30-round magazines, usually reduced to 28 rounds because of the magazine itself. At a rapid rate, a gunner could fire 4 magazines per minute, giving a figure of 112 rounds per minute. I'm also going to assume that the Bren gunner's assistant was helping the Bren gunner rather than firing his own rifle. The sources I have fail to mention the practical fire rate for a Sten gun, so I'm going to use the same figure as the MP40, which had a similar rate of fire, and just go with that, which was 180 rounds per minute. Therefore, in an 8-man section, the on-paper rounds fired per minute was 367. In a 10-man section, this would be 397, and even in an 11-man squad, it would be 412 rounds. So, assuming we have a full section of 11 British troops and a full gruppe of 10 German troops, the Germans can place more than double the number of bullets in the air than the British. 910 bullets versus 412. In fact, one MG34 or MG42 alone could put more bullets downrange than an entire British section. It's no wonder then that the British developed a plodding attitude during the war. I think you'd also be very careful when advancing against an enemy for several years that could fire more bullets at you than you could hope to fire back, especially considering the other factors. The appalling casualties in 1914-18 had led to a climate of public opinion in which the squandering of life would not be tolerated indefinitely. By 1944, the United Kingdom had been fighting for 5 years, facing many setbacks and often unfavourable odds. At least some of those generals who had reached the top and more importantly stayed there were the most methodical and calculating, deeply marked by their experience as subalterns in World War I. General Montgomery is perhaps the most obvious example. How the GI and his generals would have fought after 5 years can only be guessed at. I don't necessarily agree with that last sentence. The Germans and Soviets weren't plodding after several years of war, so the Americans may not have developed that attitude either. However, the Germans and Soviets were fighting an ideological war, which the West really wasn't. So maybe the Americans would have developed a plodding attitude over time, but obviously there's no way to know, so I don't agree with this sentence. Anyway, American squads had 12 men, a sergeant who may or may not have had a Thompson, a corporal, probably with a rifle, a 3-man BAR team. I'm going to assume that one of these would actually fire his rifle since there was 1 assistant and 1 ammunition carrier, and several standard riflemen. The Garand rifle fired about 30 rounds per minute, twice as many as the Lee Enfield and 3 times as many as the Kar 98K. Bloke on the range managed 39 rounds in a minute, again in ideal conditions with ammunition next to him. However, he did know that you could be a lot more accurate with the rounds fired in this gun due to the fact that this was a semi-automatic rifle, not a bolt action, so it may be worth taking that into consideration. The BAR fired about 60 rounds per minute due to its limited 20-round magazine. And again, the sources fail to supply basic information, so I don't have the practical rate of fire for the Thompson submachine gun. It had a faster rate of fire than the Sten and the MP40, so I'm going to guesstimate a 220 rounds per minute practical rate of fire. Doing some quick math then, a 12-man American squad had an on-paper firepower of about 550 rounds per minute. This was a higher rate of fire than the British squad, which was 412 rounds at best, but still a lot less than the German 910 rounds. This is interesting because the Americans gained a reputation for relying heavily on overwhelming material and for firing randomly. And the material advantage may be true on the strategic level, but on the squad level, this wasn't true. In fact, far from being superior soldiers, the German superiority lay in their faster firing machine guns, which could put more bullets, more material, in the air than their American opponents. The Americans only gained the reputation for firing randomly because their riflemen were ordered and trained to gain fire superiority over their enemy, which would be a tough job against the MG42. The US infantryman was taught to treat the enemy position as an area target, to be evenly filled with lead whether or not specific individuals could be seen and hit. The Soviet rifle squad has proven to be difficult to figure out. Some websites say that the Soviet rifle squad was 11 men, which is roughly what one of my sources says, but the source is vague, so I don't know. I'm just going to go with 11 men because I have no choice. My source does say that the squad was divided into 2 sub-teams, a machine gun team and a rifle team, which suggests that it's similar to the German setup. Therefore, I'm going to go with a 3-man light machine gun team, a leader with a PP Shah, and several riflemen. But I cannot confirm that this is the case, so if anyone has any more info, let me know. In theory, the Mosin Nagant rifle was similar to the Kar-98K. I don't have a source that says the practical fire rate in combat conditions, but one source does say that the rifles that preceded it could fire 10 rounds per minute, which is the same as the Kar-98K. However, bloke on the range had a truly maddening minute trying to fire the Mosin in ideal conditions and managed just 15 rounds on his 3rd go, and the first 2 goes were not so good to say the least, so 10 rounds per minute is probably being generous, but we'll go with it. The DP machine gun, which was nicknamed the Record Player, was the standard Russian light machine gun of World War II. A couple of sources say it had a cyclical fire rate of 550 or 600 rounds per minute, which is roughly the same as, or slightly higher than, the MP40 and Sten submachine guns. From this, we can then guesstimate that 200 rounds is probably its practical fire rate. Again, sources are rubbish. It could be more because the magazine holds more rounds, but it could also be less because it was more difficult to change the magazine. I don't know, so I'm just going with 200. If anyone actually knows the practical fire rate of the DP, let me know. For the PP Shah submachine gun, we have a bit of an issue. One source I have says 150 rounds per minute was probably the maximum fire rate, which seems a little low to me, since the gun could fire faster than that. However, it does note that the user was only issued 150 to 200 rounds anyway, which may have something to do with the limited firepower. And obviously, you wouldn't want to fire off all your ammunition within a minute and then be without, so I'm just going to go with 150 rounds, but if you want to add an extra 50 to the number, go ahead. Therefore, for a Russian 11-man rifle squad, they had an on-paper firepower of about 430 rounds per minute. Again, much like the British and American armies, the Soviets were outmatched in terms of raw firepower against the Germans, and it's clear that, overall, the Germans had a serious advantage in firepower, and that was purely down to their machine guns. Obviously, there's numerous things to consider as well. For starters, in combat, you're not going to have every single man firing as rapidly as possible and using up all their ammunition, and then sit there hopelessly. You're also unlikely to have fully manned teams. There's going to be casualties, and even then, not every man in the team may see the enemy or be in a position to fire back. Tactics will also come into play, as will air support, tank support, artillery support, mortar support, etc. Also, just because there's more bullets in the air doesn't mean there's more kills. If a machine gun is firing away at some guys cowering in a trench, it can fire as many rounds as it likes, it's never going to hit them. But the point is that if you can put more bullets down range than your opponents, then you may have a higher chance of hitting something, or at the very least, a better chance of suppressing them. And the German machine guns clearly have an advantage here. Numerous Allied reports from the advance across Normandy and France in 1944 speak of being caught in German machine gun crossfire, with entire battalions and even divisions unable to make significant headway against scything fire. The MG42 was nicknamed Hitler's buzzsaw or Hitler's zipper by the Allies, and the Soviets called it the linoleum ripper. It definitely had a psychological impact and was effective at keeping people's heads down under suppressing fire. Both machine guns, the MG34 and MG42, were capable of inflicting heavy casualties and of forcing large units to a standstill. Without weapons of this capability and flexibility, it is likely that Allied infantry in all theatres would have been able to advance towards their objectives at greater speed and lower cost. These weapons were true force multipliers, enabling a small team of men to put down fire that couldn't have been achieved by dozens of riflemen. Of course, the Allies answered the German machine guns with heavy weaponry, mortars, artillery, air power, etc. However, some interesting things happened at the squad level too. Typically, squads on all sides were not at full strength and would more likely have 5 or 7 men rather than 10 and upwards. But even with fewer men, they would keep their machine guns, or even get more. US squads often took 2 BARs rather than 1. Some Soviet squads also had 2 DP machine guns, although the source doesn't specify why. We do know that there was a shortage of DPs overall, with some troops being issued DT tank machine guns or Bren guns or Browning 30 cal machine guns for use instead, and I think it's reasonable to assume that Allied and Soviet infantry were trying to compensate for the lack of firepower compared to the German machine guns. This is perhaps why the Soviets were so keen on creating submachine gun squads or even entire units. Armed with the PP-Char-41 submachine guns, a 10-man squad could increase its firepower to as much as 1,500 rounds per minute, which is way more than our theoretical German squad's 910 rounds per minute. I've also done a video about Soviet small arms with a heavy focus on the submachine guns, so check that out. But one of the conclusions from that video was that the Germans would have the firepower advantage at the start of an engagement because their machine guns and rifles would outrange and or outfire the Soviet rifles and machine guns. But once the submachine guns got into range, the Soviets would have a clear advantage. Well, the calculations we made here in this video may support that video further. The Soviets may have realised that their troops didn't have sufficient firepower to contend with the German machine guns at long ranges, and so opted to compensate by using their faster firing submachine guns to do so instead. Yes, they needed to get closer and into range to use them, but once they did, they had the advantage. Same applies to the Americans. The Americans had better rifles than the German riflemen and fired rapidly to suppress or take them down. But when facing the German machine guns though, the whole squad had to be used to take them on in a firefight, and they'd struggle to match the firepower even then. So they'd call in artillery and tanks and so on, which is perhaps why they got their reputation for firing wildly and relying upon material. The British couldn't hope to match the firepower of the German machine guns, which would put 200 or more rounds into the air than an entire British squad could hope to do. So they had to plan their attack out more methodically, earning them their slow and plodding reputation. And really, when you think about it, the superiority of the German infantry is down to their superior machine guns, rather than anything else. Which is interesting. Was it really race or nationality that made the difference? Or was it just different gear? I'm obviously favouring the gear argument here because we actually have evidence for this, whereas race and nationality arguments are based on belief and pseudoscience. I think it's reasonable to assume that if every nation had started gearing up for war in 1933 like the Germans did, the German infantry advantage may not have been so clear. Thanks for watching, bye for now.